April 1943. The train screeched to a halt outside Summerfield, Texas, its iron wheels sparking against the rails in the cool night air. Italian prisoners shuffled down from the dimly lit cars, boots clattering onto the gravel, eyes adjusting to the sudden brilliance of searchlights. Dust lifted with each step as they were formed into columns. The march began, 8 miles across open panhandle country toward the new camp built to contain them. Some muttered prayers, others whispered curses at their captors. A sergeant in the middle ranks, Carlo Rossi, hummed the popular tune, the same song they had sung in North Africa to keep pace on endless desert marches. Now it served as a thread of memory in a land as foreign as the moon. Rosamunda. Rossi had been captured in Tunisia after the collapse of Italian positions under Allied pressure. The Americans, unlike the Germans, had not beaten or starved them during transport. Instead, the voyage across the Atlantic had been orderly, the food plain but plentiful. Yet suspicion ran deep. Mussolini had warned that American captivity meant degradation. The prisoners expected whips, hunger, and perhaps worse. Instead, when the gates of Camp Hereford loomed ahead, barbed wire glittering under arc lamps, they smelled coffee. Inside the wire, the first surprise waited. A mess hall, hastily built but orderly, served steaming bowls of cereal and thick black coffee. Guards watched carefully but not cruelly. One corporal spoke halting Italian to direct men toward their bunks. There were blankets, thin army-issue wool, but blankets nonetheless. Rossi, exhausted from weeks of transport, lay awake staring at the wooden rafters. The sound of wind moaned against the tin roofs, carrying the smell of Texas earth into the barracks. For the first time since capture, he felt something unexpected. Not fear, but bewilderment. Facts grounded the experience. The camp had been designed for more than 5,000 Italian prisoners, a miniature city of wood-frame barracks, guard towers, kitchens, and infirmaries. American adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention meant rations equal in quality to those served to U.S. troops, about 4,000 calories per day. To a man who had watched comrades gnaw at dry crusts in Tunisia, the difference bordered on impossible. Still, the distrust lingered. Rossi whispered to another prisoner that this abundance must be a trick, a temporary kindness before harsher treatment arrived. Yet when dawn broke, the camp revealed itself not as a dungeon, but as an organized machine, rows of barracks, drills for sanitation, daily roll calls. What they did not yet know was that America's machine extended far beyond these fences, into factories, depots, and shipyards that dwarfed anything the Axis could imagine. Rossi drifted to uneasy sleep with the taste of coffee still on his tongue. The night march had ended, but another journey, one that would turn enemies into unexpected allies, had just begun. 2 weeks later, in a Boston newspaper passed from guard to prisoner, a headline leapt from the page. United States to produce 85,000 aircraft in 1943. The Italians read and reread the number in disbelief. In their homeland, factories strained to push out a few hundred machines a year, many obsolete before they left the hangar. Here, one nation's annual production dwarfed the entire Italian Air Force. Rossi traced the figure with his finger, muttering, "Impossibile." Captain John Riley, a quartermaster officer newly posted to Benicia Arsenal in California, understood what those numbers meant in practice. He walked each day through cavernous warehouses stacked to their rafters, rifles in endless racks, bolts gleaming under electric lights, ammunition boxes piled like city blocks. He carried the specifications in his head as though they were scripture. The U.S. rifle, caliber .30, M1, Garand, semi-automatic, 8 rounds loaded by M-block clip, firing the .30-06 cartridge at 2,800 feet per second. By war's end, more than 5.4 million would be produced. It was, as General Patton had already declared, the greatest battle implement ever devised. Riley saw them daily in such numbers that he barely noticed, but to men like Rossi, The sight of even a single Garand was proof of a chasm between nations. Rations told the same story. Each K-ration meal box, breakfast, dinner, supper, contained a small can of meat, biscuits, candy, powdered drink, and a 4-pack of cigarettes. The caloric load, nearly 4,000 per day, astonished Italians who had lived through ration lines and hunger at the front. Cigarettes, once currency on the black market, here came standard issue. For Riley, abundance created its own problems. Surpluses clogged depots, parts piled high. He joked to fellow officers that the Army wasted more in a week than the Axis could supply in a year. It was not exaggeration. Reports confirmed that in 1943, a single American auto plant, converted to military output, surpassed Italy's total tank production for the entire war. Rossi and his comrades slowly began to sense that the war's outcome had already been decided before they ever surrendered. Mussolini had promised that fascist discipline and tradition would defeat soft democracies. Yet here was proof that democracy's factories, guided by engineers and powered by workers, could outproduce an empire into extinction. Late one evening, Rossi was assigned to help stack rations. He ran his hand across the printed stencils on the crates. 10-in-1 rations, each crate feeding 10 men for a day. Pallets stretched farther than the eye could follow. He laughed quietly, a sound of resignation rather than joy. In this warehouse, the war's verdict was written not in blood, but in tonnage. By September 1943, the air inside the barracks at Camp Hereford was charged with rumor. Men whispered that Mussolini had been arrested, that King Victor Emmanuel had betrayed the Duce, that Marshal Pietro Badoglio had signed something with the Allies. Radios were forbidden, but guards' newspapers and letters from home trickled through the wire. On the night of September 8th, word spread that Italy had surrendered. Some cheered, others spat, calling it treachery. Rossi sat silently on his bunk, torn between relief that the war might end and shame at his country's collapse. The official news followed days later. On September 13th, Italy declared war on Germany. For the Americans, the change was swift and practical. War Department memoranda reclassified Italian prisoners. No longer hostile captives, they were co-belligerents. The term seemed absurd to men who had marched into Texas in chains only months before, but its meaning was profound. With one signature, they were no longer enemies. They were potential allies. Captain Riley received the new directives at Benicia Arsenal. Italian service units would be formed, each company ranging from 40 to 250 men, led by their own officers but under American supervision. They would not carry arms, but they would work at depots, ports, farms, and hospitals. Riley, faced with chronic manpower shortages, recognized the opportunity immediately. A trained soldier might be worth 10 civilian laborers when it came to discipline and endurance. The irony did not escape the prisoners. Just a year earlier, they had fought side by side with Germans in the deserts of North Africa. Now they were being asked to serve in American uniforms, while their former comrades became enemies. Some refused outright, hardcore fascists who clung to the memory of Mussolini's promises. They were kept at Hereford, isolated and bitter. But the majority, hungry for dignity and weary of war, accepted the offer. Rossi turned over the uniform in his hands the first day it was issued. Olive drab fatigues, standard U.S. cut with one difference. A cloth patch sewn above the left breast, bordered in red, center green. The word Italy stitched boldly across it. He slipped it on slowly, feeling both humiliation and relief. Humiliation because he was now marked as a servant of those he had once fought. Relief because, for the first time since Tunisia, he was no longer a prisoner, but a soldier again, answerable to Italian officers in service to a new cause. That night, as the men lined up for their first paid work assignments, 10 cents an hour in canteen scrip, the camp buzzed with uncertain pride. The prisoners were becoming workers, and workers were becoming allies. Beyond the wire, the war still raged, but inside the camp, the first threads of reconciliation had been tied. The first morning in his new fatigues, Rossi caught sight of himself in a cracked mirror nailed to the barracks wall. For a moment he did not recognize the reflection. The cut was American, the boots American, the cap American. Only the patch above his heart reminded him who he was. Italy, bold white letters on green cloth. It was as if he wore two flags at once, one past and one future, both stitched into the same fabric. Work assignments began at once. Italian service units were dispatched to depots, hospitals, and farms across the United States. Some went to the Mira Loma Quartermaster Depot in California, where they stacked uniforms by the tens of thousands. Others moved to South Boston, unloading Liberty ships heavy with ammunition and rations. At Letterman Hospital, Italians pushed gurneys and sterilized instruments while American nurses tended to wounded GIs. Everywhere, the work freed Americans for combat. By the end of 1944, nearly 90% of all Italian POWs in the United States had volunteered for these units. For Captain Riley, the transformation was startling. Just weeks before, he had struggled to meet quotas with skeleton crews of civilian labor. Now, trained Italian soldiers worked with precision, moving pallets and cataloging parts. Their officers, proud to wear uniforms again, barked orders in Italian that echoed through the warehouses. To Riley's eye, the change was less about loyalty than about dignity. These men wanted to be useful again, and usefulness was a currency more valuable than pay. The pay still mattered, though. 10 cents an hour, usually in canteen scrip, allowed Italians to buy soap, extra food, even cigarettes at the camp store. For men who had been stripped of everything, even that small wage represented recognition. Rossi lined up with the others, accepting his first payment with mixed emotions. He remembered his capture, the humiliation of surrender. Now here he was, queuing under the American flag, collecting American wages. Not all were convinced. A handful muttered that the uniform was a betrayal, that working for the Americans dishonored their service in Africa. Yet when the men sat down to eat, their trays filled with rations that exceeded anything they had known at the front, their resistance faltered. Hot food, steady work, pay in their pockets, these were not empty promises, but daily reality. That evening, Rossi walked past the wire fence, his cap low against the Texas wind. Beyond the guard towers, the prairie stretched unbroken, a horizon wide enough to swallow the memory of defeat. He touched the patch on his chest and whispered to himself, "Better to work for life than to die for Mussolini." It was not loyalty yet, but it was the first step toward it. Benicia Arsenal, California, stretched like a cathedral of steel and wood. Captain Riley walked the length of the warehouse one morning in 1944, boots echoing against concrete, flanked by endless racks of rifles. To his left, crates of M1 Garands gleamed, their oiled walnut stocks lined as neatly as choir stalls. To his right, pallets of ammunition stacked so high, the top rows vanished into shadow. It was a sight few Axis soldiers ever imagined possible. For the Italians newly assigned to the post, it bordered on the surreal. Rossi arrived with his detachment of Italian service unit men, boots crunching on the gravel yard as they were marched inside. The sergeant expected disorder, the chaotic bustle of wartime supply he had known in Africa, where units fought over spare parts like beggars. Instead, he entered a system that ran like clockwork. Every rifle was tagged, every round inventoried. The numbers astounded him. By 1944, America had already produced more than 5 million Garands. Italy, in all the war years combined, had not managed a fraction of that output in rifles of every type. The statistics came alive in Benicia. Riley watched as Italians unloaded boxcars filled with crates marked 10-in-1 rations. Each wooden container was designed to feed 10 men for one day. One train carried enough to sustain a division longer than Italian depots could supply an army. He knew the figures from his reports. In 1943 alone, the United States had built 85,000 aircraft. Italy's entire wartime production barely touched 12,000. For Riley, These were numbers to track on charts. For Rossi, they were a revelation written in wood and steel. The Italians marveled at what the Americans considered waste. Slightly bent rifle barrels, chipped stocks, or mislabeled crates were discarded to scrap. Rossi picked up a discarded bolt, smooth and functional by his measure, and shook his head. In Africa, his regiment might have fought a battle to control a supply of such pieces. Here, Americans swept them into bins for recycling. Waste on this scale exceeded the total resources Italy had once prized. Work became routine, shifting boxes, cataloging crates, stacking rations, but each day reinforced the same message. Democracy's arsenal was not propaganda. It was a tangible, overwhelming fact. Men who had once believed in Mussolini's boasts about fascist strength now lived inside proof that those promises had been hollow. At the end of his shift, Rossi sat outside the warehouse, watching the sun dip behind the California hills. Liberty ships in the nearby bay were being loaded, their cranes swinging crates into holds bound for Europe. He knew that every box packed by his hands would feed, arm, or clothe an American soldier. Quietly, he admitted to himself what no Italian officer would yet say aloud. The war's outcome was already decided. Texas, 1945. The wind carried dust across the panhandle, stinging eyes and filling mouths with grit. Yet inside St. Mary's Church in Umbarger, the air was different. Cool plaster walls, the faint scent of candle wax, and the murmur of brushes on wet lime. Italian POW artists bent over scaffolds, mixing pigments in army mess tins, painting visions of angels and saints across the nave. The work had begun during a ration shortfall. Camp kitchens at Hereford cut meals to the minimum, and hunger gnawed at the prisoners again. Parishioners from Umbarger, sympathetic and faithful, brought food to share: bread, chicken, vegetables. In return, Italian craftsmen offered their art. Franco di Bello and his fellow POWs transformed the small church into a gallery of frescoes rivaling those of Tuscany. Rossi, though not an artist himself, often volunteered to carry supplies into the sanctuary, grateful for the smells of home cooking and the laughter of local families. Mary O'Donnell, a young parishioner, remembered the first day clearly. She had expected bitterness or sullenness from the prisoners. Instead, she saw men who smiled shyly, grateful for every plate passed across the fence. Watching them work on the murals, she began to realize that beneath uniforms and allegiances lay common humanity. When she asked one POW how long the colors would last, he grinned and told her, "As long as the church stands." Burry, another Italian at Hereford, found his own escape in paint. Captured in Tunisia, he had been a doctor before the war. In the barracks, he began painting on discarded burlap sacks, mixing colors from whatever he could find. His crude canvases would later carry him to international fame, but at the time they were acts of survival, proof that creativity endured even behind wire. The rules of the Geneva Convention permitted religious practice and recreation, but what unfolded in Umbarger went beyond regulation. It was a meeting of cultures in the most unlikely place, a Texas parish and an Italian prisoner camp bound by food, faith, and art. For the Americans, generosity softened the image of their enemy. For the Italians, kindness replaced fear with admiration. When the frescoes were finished, the townspeople wept at their beauty. The prisoners returned to camp, bellies full and spirits lifted. For Rossi, the day marked a turning point. The Americans had not just fed him, they had trusted him to work unguarded in their church, to leave behind something lasting. He pressed his hand against the plaster one last time, leaving no mark, only color that would outlive him. That night, as he walked back into camp, the fences seemed less like barriers and more like boundaries already fading. The war might continue overseas, but in Texas, enemies were becoming neighbors. South Boston, 1944. Fog clung to the waterfront as cranes swung overhead, lowering crates into the cavernous holds of Liberty ships. The shouts of dock workers echoed between warehouses, but among the teams pushing dollies and stacking pallets were men in American uniforms with an unusual insignia. Italy, stitched in bold letters across their caps. These were the Italian service units, former prisoners who had chosen labor over idleness, usefulness over bitterness. Rossi's unit had been transferred from Texas to Boston that spring. He remembered stepping onto the pier for the first time, the smell of salt and diesel heavy in the air. Liberty ships, gray and immense, lined the wharves. He had never seen so many vessels together, each one a steel giant capable of crossing the Atlantic laden with more cargo than an entire Italian division could consume in a month. Captain Riley, now responsible for coordinating depot work across several East Coast sites, watched his Italian crews with a mixture of relief and astonishment. These were not the sullen prisoners he had expected, but disciplined soldiers, accustomed to orders, eager for structure. Under the command of their own Italian officers, they moved with precision, loading crates of rations, ammunition, and spare parts faster than civilian labor had ever managed. For Riley, every hour they worked freed another American for combat duty overseas. The statistics confirmed the transformation. By late 1944, nearly 90% of Italian prisoners in the United States had joined service units. In Boston alone, hundreds labored each day to keep the logistical arteries of the war pumping. Their hands hoisted the very ammunition that would pound German lines in France and the very rations that would feed the men storming the Pacific Islands. There were moments of tension. German POWs were still held in separate compounds nearby, and some Italians feared retribution if they were seen cooperating. But the tide of the war had shifted. Italy itself was now at war with Germany, and the men found comfort in that official truth. "We are not traitors," Rossi told a comrade one evening, wiping sweat from his brow. "We fight in our own way now." The irony was not lost on him. He had once marched beside German units under Mussolini's banners. Now he stood on an American pier, loading weapons destined to kill those same Germans. Yet instead of shame, he felt a flicker of pride. By contributing here, he had regained a sense of purpose stolen in Tunisia. As dusk fell, Rossi paused to watch a Liberty ship ease away from the pier, its deck stacked high with supplies. The fog swallowed it slowly, but he knew its cargo would soon tip the balance of a battlefield half a world away. In that moment, he understood the depth of the shift. He was no longer a prisoner watching history. He was part of it. The first time Rossi entered a warehouse stacked with American rations, he laughed aloud. Row after row of wooden crates stretched like avenues through a city of food. Each was stenciled with numbers and designations: 10-in-1 ration, K-ration, breakfast unit, cigarettes, 4-count. He traced the labels with his fingers, astonished that meals here came with luxuries that had been unimaginable at the front. In Tunisia, he had lived on crusts of bread and watery soup. The occasional tin of sardines passed among a squad. Now every American soldier received nearly 4,000 calories a day. Candy bars, powdered drinks, canned meat, even chewing gum. Items once rare treasures were issued as standard fare. And always, cigarettes. Rossi lit his first rationed Lucky Strike with shaking hands. He exhaled and muttered with a grin, "America del Ben di Dio." America, land of God's plenty. Captain Riley saw the astonishment daily. Italians marveled at the sheer scale of what Americans discarded. Crates with dented corners, biscuits gone slightly stale, cigarettes with torn paper, waste in American terms, treasure in Italian eyes. At Benicia Arsenal, Riley had once ordered a bin of defective rifle bolts, scrapped. An Italian corporal held one up and said quietly, "With this, my regiment could have fought a battle." Riley nodded, uneasy at the gulf such a statement revealed. The numbers told the story in sharper relief than any anecdote. U.S. petroleum production by December 1944 reached over 5.2 million barrels per day, fuel enough to drive the convoys that supplied every front. Aircraft production had passed 300,000 units by war's end, with 85,000 rolling off assembly lines in 1943 alone. Italy's entire wartime output of aircraft was scarcely a fraction of that figure. In rifles, America's single Garand program outproduced all of Italy's small arms combined. For the Italians, abundance was not just impressive, it was transformative. They began to understand why Mussolini's promises had collapsed so quickly in North Africa. No amount of discipline or rhetoric could match an enemy who could feed, clothe, and arm millions without pause. The war had not been lost because Italians were cowards, as fascist propaganda insisted. It had been lost because the enemy had factories that never slept. One evening, Rossi stood outside the depot smoking the second of his daily ration cigarettes. Around him, crates towered like monuments. He thought of the men still fighting in Italy, scraping for supplies in mountain villages, and shook his head. If they could see this place, he thought, they would know at once that the war was finished. He flicked the cigarette butt into the dirt and ground it under his heel. In that gesture was acceptance, not just of defeat, but of a truth greater than any battlefield could reveal. America's power lay not only in its soldiers, but in its abundance. And abundance was a weapon no army could resist. In Washington, charts lined the walls of the War Department. Lines and columns tracked divisions, shipping tonnage, troop ceilings. Amid the numbers were annotations few outside the bureaucracy noticed. Italian service units credited as manpower equivalents. For planners straining to meet combat needs in Europe and the Pacific, every crate stacked by an Italian meant another American rifleman free for the front. Captain Riley studied those reports with satisfaction. Where once he had begged for civilian labor, he now commanded entire units of trained soldiers. They unloaded Liberty ships in Boston, sewed uniforms at Mira Loma, sterilized instruments at Letterman Hospital. The work was invisible in headlines, but decisive in effect. By 1944, nearly 90% of Italian POWs in the United States, some 45,000 men, were serving in these units. They represented tens of thousands of American troops redirected to Normandy's beaches, to the Ardennes, to Iwo Jima. Rossi felt the weight of that irony each day he hauled crates or checked manifests. He had fought in Africa beside German allies, only to now supply the weapons that would kill them. At first, it seemed betrayal, but as months passed, it became redemption. He was no longer idle behind wire. He was part of something immense. Every ship he loaded carried supplies for men pushing back tyranny across the globe. His hands were small pieces in a vast machine, but they were not meaningless. The numbers confirmed what his eyes already knew. A single U.S. auto plant, converted to military production, produced more tanks in a year than Italy had managed across the entire war. Liberty ships rolled off assembly lines at the rate of nearly 3 per day. By contrast, Mussolini's navy had struggled to replace losses with a handful of hulls. In rifles, America's Garand program alone eclipsed all Italian small arms output. These were not statistics to Rossi. They were ships sailing out of Boston Harbor, their decks groaning under the weight of abundance. Not every Italian welcomed the transformation. In compounds where hardcore fascists were confined, rumors spread that service unit men were traitors, cowards willing to don the victor's cloth. But when letters arrived from home, describing hunger, bombings, the German occupation, doubts eroded. Serving the Americans was no longer collaboration. It was survival, and perhaps the only honorable path left. One evening, Rossi leaned against a pier bollard as another ship eased into the Atlantic. Its destination was secret, but its meaning was clear. Italy's defeat was no longer just a memory of Tunisia. It was written in every crate, every ration tin, every bolt of cloth loaded by Italian hands. Mussolini's men had become unwilling witnesses and active participants in his undoing. The war ended not with fanfare in the camps, but with silence. In May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the news came by radio and whispers through the barracks. Some Italians cheered, others crossed themselves. For Rossi, the moment brought relief laced with melancholy. He had labored in America's depots for 2 years, found dignity in work, even friendship across the barbed wire. Now it was nearly over. At Hereford, the prisoners left their final gift, a small chapel built from scavenged bricks and scrap lumber. They laid glass for windows, painted murals of saints, carved simple benches. It was a votive offering, an act of faith and gratitude. When Mass was said there for the first time, guards and prisoners alike bowed their heads together. Decades later, the chapel would be restored and rededicated, proof that reconciliation had roots even in captivity. In Umbarger, townspeople wept when the Italian artist completed the frescoes at St. Mary's. The prisoners had been fed in kitchens and welcomed into homes, and now their work would outlast the war. One parishioner declared, "They came as enemies, but they leave as friends." Rossi visited the church one last time, pressing his palm to the plastered wall. He knew the colors would remain long after he boarded the ship home. Not all endings were joyful. At Hereford, 5 Italians who had died during internment were buried under Texas soil, their graves marked by simple crosses. For their comrades, the memory was a reminder that captivity had not been without sacrifice. Yet compared to the carnage in Europe, the numbers were mercifully small. America had kept its word under the Geneva Convention, rations equal to U.S. troops, medical care, religious freedom. These commitments had saved lives and reshaped loyalties. By early 1946, repatriation began in earnest. Prisoners boarded trains once more, but this time there was no night march under suspicion, no fear of cruelty. Instead, there were handshakes with guards, waves from civilians who had shared food and stories. Some men promised to return, and in the years ahead, many would, emigrating back to the land where they had first discovered abundance. On the pier, Rossi looked one last time at the American flag snapping in the harbor wind. He thought of the warehouses, the cranes, the mountains of rations, the cigarettes handed out as casually as bread. He thought of the chapel and the murals, of evenings when generosity had erased enmity. As his ship pulled away, he saluted the flag, not as a prisoner, but as a man who had glimpsed the future. Italy in 1946 was a land of ruins. Cities lay in rubble, bridges collapsed into rivers, and hunger haunted every alley. Returning POWs stepped off ships not into triumph but into scarcity deeper than the one they had left behind. For many, memories of captivity in America felt like dreams. Dreams of full plates, hot showers, cigarettes issued as casually as buttons. The contrast was almost cruel. Rossi walked the streets of Rome and saw bread lines stretching around corners. He remembered warehouses in Boston stacked with ration crates to the rafters. His family spoke of shortages so severe that even children went without shoes. He thought of the K-rations, each box containing not only food, but luxuries, candy, gum, coffee, that here could only be found on the black market. The memory of abundance became a haunting comparison, but also a beacon. Word spread quickly among returnees. Men who had labored in American depots told neighbors of kindness, fairness, and a machine of democracy that had outproduced entire empires. Their stories carried weight, for these were not propagandists, but veterans who had lived under both flags. They told of wages earned in scrip, of Mass celebrated freely, of towns like Umbarger, where strangers had shared food across barbed wire. In a country weary of warlords and ideology, these tales became seeds of admiration. Some men resolved never to stay. By the late 1940s, thousands applied for visas, determined to return to the land they had once entered as prisoners. For them, America had shown not only abundance but possibility. In the decades ahead, Italian immigrants who had first worn U.S. uniforms with Italy stitched across the chest would become citizens, workers, and builders of the nation they had learned to respect behind fences. Others carried America with them in subtler ways. Alberto Burri, once a doctor captured in Tunisia, returned to Italy with burlap paintings begun in Hereford. His art, born of POW improvisation, grew into one of the most important modernist movements of post-war Europe. He never forgot the barracks, where he first stretched sackcloth into canvas. The texture of American captivity became the texture of a new cultural voice. Rossi, too, carried memory. He told his children of the chapel at Hereford, of Liberty ships sailing out under fog, of the ration cigarette that tasted like victory. He did not romanticize captivity. It had been bitter and humiliating, but he admitted it had taught him something profound, that democracy could defeat dictatorship not only with bullets, but with bread. One evening in the late 1950s, sitting on a Roman balcony, Rossi watched his son unwrap an American chocolate bar sent by relatives abroad. He smiled. The war was long over, but its lessons lingered in sweetness and memory. In the final tally, the war's verdict could be read in numbers as stark as any battlefield report. America built nearly 300,000 aircraft, more than 25 times Italy's entire wartime output. In 1943 alone, U.S. factories produced 85,000 planes, more in 12 months than the Axis nation could manage across all 6 years. A single American plant, converted from automobiles to tanks, outproduced Mussolini's entire armored industry. Petroleum flowed from U.S. wells at over 5.2 million barrels a day, fueling fleets and convoys while Axis armies stalled for lack of fuel. Rifles told the same story. The M1 Garand, semi-automatic and rugged, rolled off assembly lines in quantities exceeding 5.4 million. Italy's Carcano, bolt-action and already obsolete, never came close. In food alone, America's system dwarfed the enemy. K rations at 4,000 calories daily, 10-in-1 crates feeding divisions as casually as households, cigarettes issued by the billions. These were not luxuries. They were weapons of endurance. For the Italians who had seen both worlds, these figures were not abstractions. They were lived experience. Rossi remembered warehouses where waste bins overflowed with parts that would have been treasures in Rome. He remembered cigarettes handed out like candy, fuel pumped endlessly into trucks. He remembered Liberty ships, built at a rate of 3 per day, vanishing into the Atlantic horizon, each carrying more tonnage than Italy's navy could have dreamed of delivering. The impossible statistic was not just quantity, it was transformation. Of the roughly 51,000 Italian POWs held in America, nearly 90% volunteered for service units. Men captured as enemies became contributors to Allied victory. Their loyalty had been bought not by force but by fairness, not by coercion but by abundance. It was a conversion as decisive as any battle, one that propaganda could never have achieved. The legacy endured. Chapels and murals stood in Texas and Wyoming, silent witnesses to reconciliation. Burry's canvases carried the imprint of American captivity onto world stages. Families in Italy told stories of a land where prisoners had eaten better than civilians at home, where democracy treated enemies with dignity and turned them into admirers. In the end, the story of the Italian POWs was more than a footnote. It was proof of the central truth of the Second World War. America triumphed not because it loved war more, but because it could feed, clothe, arm, and transport armies on a scale that defied imagination. Freedom's arsenal was as much about cigarettes and chocolate as it was about tanks and bombers. As the decades passed, the murals in Umbarger and the chapel at Hereford remained. Visitors stood in silence, staring at colors laid down by men who once marched under Mussolini's flag. Their work whispered the same truth as the statistics, that in America, abundance was destiny, and destiny was freedom.